Hi James, can you introduce yourself and tell me what capacity you're here?
Okay. My name's James Horton. I'm a founder and CEO of a data management analytics organisation called Datanomics. And we do a lot of work around data sharing, shared governance, ethics, and a range of. Won't go into all the details, but certainly in that's certainly in our space. And so my interest really around this conference was, in a sense of what happens to the data after it becomes not just but collected through wearables, how we use it, and the processes that we might apply to the data in between its collection and its ultimate usage in some fashion. And the ethics and the privacy issues that are associated with it, and the level of controls that we may or may not have in relation to those. So,
did you get any answers around that, or more questions?
Oh no, I wasn't really expecting answers in the sense that I guess there are some universal issues around those. In my mind, around if you take it down to a basic level, there's a data contributor or an origin point. There are actors that actually process the data in some fashion, where they aggregate it or analyse or derive it, and then there are people that consume it. And of course, we might actually be the originator and the consumer, and there are going to be other interested parties that, as a consequence of what happens, have a stake in that, and that applies generically to all data in the sense that we use and share in some fashion. So to me, there's a lot of the questions is what are the, as me as an originator of the data, what rights do I have to control it, benefit from it? If there are people that are in the media processing that data, in my mind, it's what are their ethical obligations to honour what I want done. Or that relationship, and then there's the other side of it. Is from a usage point of view, it says, well, does the usage domain actually create certain? How is the data to be used in a legitimate way, and how does that usage affect, in a sense, the other actors in that model? So, and I guess, in general terms, that's a lot of what I do and the work I do. I mean, my interest really in a cold context is what then become the cultural overlays in that sort of discussion. Because really, in a sense, as much as we may have all sorts of regulation around health data and privacy, personal data, the reality is that data, in a personal sense, it's flexible. What we perceive as private has a cultural overlay. So different cultures will actually perceive different types of data, whether it's health or various. Behavioural or in different ways. So the Germans actually will think, we'd be happy to share some data but not others, and that profile will actually be quite different from the Chinese. And I think it's an area that hasn't really been looked at, that well. And I guess the other side of it, we also know culturally, is that our notions of what we consider private are different. And so the Western notion of privacy is a very individualistic one about in our law, in a whole process, while as in a lot of other cultures, you may actually find that there's a much stronger sense of privacy in a group context. That I have a right, my group has a right to be private, or I have a right to not be identified with a certain group. And so that to me also has some really interesting sort of cultural overlays that says that there'll be certain maybe certain diseases or illnesses that will be considered taboo. So my right not to be identified with someone, even if I do suffer that in that group, actually might become quite compelling. How
do we go forward with that then? What's the best?
Well, I think my sense is that if I sort of project myself forward to say to this work, what would be really good to see is, in a sense, the development of guidelines that says if we're building these kinds of applications, how do we build them in a way that's in a culturally sensitive manner? So what are those dimensions that we need to be looking for within that? What are the broad, what are those sort of broad categories that we need to be kind of being aware of, that when we go to do that, we need to recognise it. And some of that might be around, we need to recognise that different cultures have different notions of privacy. The other side of it is that there's, even in the sort of the most basic level of language and semantics, we need to be sort of careful about how we express it.
What's an example?
Well, look, there's certain. Look, in some cases, the word just isn't there. So I mean, I can't. Some languages there isn't even a word for cancer. I mean, and sometimes the fact the word isn't there will tell you something about the reason that it's not there. And so that's one aspect. But it's also the way that if you're trying to also communicate with some groups around the technology or what we're doing or how they might use it, typically it's all written in English. Typically, the internet's full of data. So, do we provide, sort of, how do we storybook that in a way? Is that the most appropriate way to express it? I mean, the other thing that I'd be really the more I think about it, it's quite interesting, is that all the technology we talk about, the Fitbits, all these bits, embedded in the design of these technologies is a cultural overlay. They're built by a Western company and Western designers, and as much as they have spent a lot on the design, the element is that inherently there's a kind of there's a white Western DNA in there. So I'm sort of curious in a sense that it's not to say we change, but how do we make ourselves aware of that? How do we break that down to sort of understand that? Because if we don't understand that, we're not going to understand how do we build or apply these things in a different context in a way that'll get used.
And do you think it's going to be researchers and community health people who do that work, or
Yes.
will the manufacturers of this technology suddenly go, oh yeah, we could do that?
Well, I don't think that. No, well, they won't do it unless they see money in it. That's the. So I mean, to the extent that the Chinese have got a big population and they'll build things that suit them, absolutely. We'll see. It'll come out of those, but in a way, technology has been really dominated by kind of a sort of a very much sort of a Western technology model, and I think that's the. And look, it's interesting that but you already see in the social media in the sense that admittedly the Chinese have blocked Facebook and other things, but the point is that the dominant social media communication Chinese groups is Weibo, and it's a completely different environment, and it has a messaging, but it's come from a messaging thing that actually has built Facebook and purchasing and a whole bunch, and it's actual what's amazing I've got a lot of former schoolmates that are from China, and so they use it all the time, and what's interesting is that in the way that Weibo's designed is the translation's built into it, so it basically knows that I'm if I say in English, so all of their little sort of messaging boxes automatically gets translated to me into English as I message.
And tell me, what's the message then for this?
What's interesting is that in that Chinese context, because they're all multilingual and they're having to do, and because it's a Northern Asian, so it's dealing with it's dealing with character, double byte character set. So it's having to deal with sort of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Cantonese, and Mandarin. The idea of being sort of a multilingual communication tool and actually doing online and immediate translation was just a no-brainer. But the idea that actually you would have a translation thing built into a Facebook or anything else wouldn't have been completely not. So, that's a good example, I suppose, in a sense that that ability to communicate across languages was just embedded from them almost from the beginning. And it's amazing to actually have this conversation with someone who's actually typing in Mandarin and I'm typing back in English, and we're having this quite comfortable conversation on
it can be done.
Honest, and it's seamless. So and I guess that's one example, but I guess in a way is that I'm more interested in how do we in that more personal context, what is that? How do we build applications that that basically are going to be culturally more sensitive, and I think in a way we need to understand what those building blocks are. It's not what is it, and look, the other thing about a culture is that it's not always. Some of them will have some characteristics will be cultural, but some of those characteristics will be transcultural. So just the fact that maybe a socioeconomic characteristic might apply to a culture doesn't mean it's tied to the culture. So in a sense, those building blocks, both have a horizontal and a vertical, if you will. but it's so whether we're built. So in a sense, we solve for both. One is to recognise that if we're going to design, and it really, look, admittedly, a lot of applications maybe it's not mainstream, it's not an issue, but there are going to be some things as we get down into, and healthcare is one, where we're dealing with people's wellness or illness. And wellness is one set of data, which is one also has so how we perceive wellness and how we perceive illness are also very certainly in this particular space. Quite interesting. So, and that then same thing has big cultural, and we saw it hinted at today. The issue is that different cultures also look at that. We have our sort of Western medical model is very different to a Chinese one.
Right.
So, and Chinese and potentially with Indian, Arab Vedic models. So, how do we sort of build those into a script?
Everything's telling us to go. Thank you.
But I'm sort of running
much,
out, but that's
James.
it, if that helps.
Thank you.